Tuberculosis was another weapon in the arsenal of germ warfare used against Native people in Canada. A fiercely communicable disease, spread quickly by air and contaminated food, tuberculosis was responsible for many of the deaths of children in Indian residential schools across Canada. According to government officials like Dr. Peter Bryce, residential school staff deliberately and regularly exposed healthy Indian children to tuberculosis by forcing them to sleep and play alongside children dying of the disease, and then denying them aid or treatment. It was this murderous practice that was responsible for an annual death rate in the residential schools of nearly 50%.
We're in the same room with people who had TB. They didn't separate us.
Then we were forced to play with them. The nuns made us play with those kids. We didn't want to get sick either, but they were forcing us to play with those kids. And also, they made some of them sleep with the other kids too.
The interesting thing was at the University of British Columbia, where I began to study for a doctoral degree, I began to find these records from a report by a guy called Dr. Peter Bryce, he was head medical officer for Indian Affairs. And in 1907, he went on a tour of all the schools out here, like on the coast and in the prairies. And he found that he claims that over half the children were dying every year from tuberculosis. And specifically from a practice whereby healthy children were brought in and housed alongside children dying of tuberculosis. And then none of them were treated or helped in any way. They were left to die of this communicable disease.
Why?
Because they wanted to kill off at least half the children and wanted to cull the numbers down. And Dr. Bryce, this is not some flaming radical. He's an establishment doctor who's reporting back to his boss, the Duncan Campbell Scott, who was head of Indian Affairs. And he said in his report, the quote is, "I believe that conditions are being deliberately created to spread infectious diseases." So he was clear, children were being deliberately murdered by a practice of contaminating them with TB. That practice was referred to consistently. It's now even talked about in some of the mainstream academic books about the residential schools. So it's gradually been accepted, although it was reported on the front page of the Ottawa Citizen as far back as 1907. This is from Schools Aid White Plague. This is a discussion of Dr. Bryce's report. It's from November 15th, 1907. About 100 years ago, they said the average death in the residential schools in the West was 69%. So over 2/3 of the kids die after 1 year in these schools. That's talked about in the mainstream press, and yet today so many people are acting like, oh, we didn't know this. Well, it's been public knowledge for a century in Canada.
There's about 50% of the kids that died of TB. And one thing I can tell too is that the chief over there now, her mother had 12 siblings. She was the last one that lived out of that school. She's seen 12 of her brothers and sisters go in there, plus herself, but she came out. She said then the other ones never made it home.
The Indian residential school system in Canada was an extension and evolution of an older system of genocide that began as early as 1540 in eastern Canada and during the 1840s on the Pacific coast. Its foundational purpose was the deliberate and systematic eradication of all Indigenous populations that would not leave their lands and resources, abolish their own cultures and languages, and become Christians. That purpose has never wavered, but has assumed different forms and strategies over the centuries, adapted to the times and regions in which it played out as European conquest moved westward across the continent. European Christianity and its colonial empires were the plague. Residential schools were a refinement of that contagion. By the time that residential schools were firmly established across Canada, around 1900, the plague itself had exterminated most Aboriginal people, in a genocide whose details are still largely unrecorded and perhaps forgotten.
Well, we can look at the evidence of genocide we can look at it and yet our mind not register the fact that it's proof of what we're talking about. This book is used in the university curriculum about residential schools. It has been for almost 10 years. And here's a picture of children with active tuberculosis sores. You see the bandages around their head. And the inscription says they have active, like open tubercular sores, and they're sitting here alongside healthy children. That was the practice described by Dr. Peter Bryce when he said they were being deliberately exposed to diseases. They weren't being quarantined. When you have tuberculosis, you're quarantined. You don't sit with healthy children. This is proof. This is proof of intent to commit genocide, this picture right here. Yet it's in a mainstream text, people look at it, and still to this day they say there's no proof that we're trying to kill Native people. Well, the proof is right there in that picture. Study of a general called Jeffery Amherst, and Amherst, Nova Scotia is named after him. He was a British general who conducted germ warfare against the Mi'kmaq Indians in Nova Scotia. And in the 1740s, he kept a journal of this. And he was so brazen, he didn't hesitate to record what he was doing in the journal. Again, because they didn't figure they'd ever have to answer to anybody since they were the law. And in it, he describes how they would go into hospitals where their own people had been dying of smallpox. And they took the blankets and he gave it to one of his subordinates, a major, who then took it out among the Mi'kmaq and the other Indians who were allied with the French, like the Huron and the Algonquin-speaking Indians in the eastern part of Canada. They were targeted. In fact, most of the Huron were exterminated by smallpox. So they were openly admitting that they were doing this. And all up and down Vancouver Island, you have stories of the same thing happening, although happening through the missionaries primarily, because they were the first ones into the area. Harriet describes in her village a little place called Claus near Port Renfrew on the west side of Vancouver Island. She says in the 1860s there was 3,400 people there. By the 1890s there were 44. So it had gone from over 3,000 people down to 40 some odd people. 98.5% of the population gone. And that was mostly from smallpox. And their people say that missionaries and British sailors had been dropping off these blankets to them that were laced with smallpox, and that's how so many people died. You don't get that many people dying, kind of accidentally. Somebody caught a cold one day. I mean, that isn't the way those things happen. It was germ warfare.